You don't want to be sacrificing the synergy of your deck on the altar of mana efficiency. One example of improving the efficiency of our decks is looking at cards like Rampant Growth and replacing them with cards like Farseek. Farseek can get into play non-basic lands that have basic land types, like your Shocklands and your Triomes, and so that would be an optimal improvement to your deck. If you're playing a commander like Animar that has access to Growth Spiral effects that let you draw a card and put a land into play, you might consider playing a less mana value optimal card like Scale the Heights because it has additional synergy with your deck. Scale the Heights lets us draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter up to one target creature, gain 2 life, and play an additional land this turn. It's less efficient than Growth Spiral, but synergizes more with our decks, and we don't want to sacrifice mana value to have our deck be less coherent. We all know from playing our +1/+1 counter-based decks that you can jam the board full of harden effects, doubling effects, and creatures that love having +1/+1 counters on them and give them flying or trample, but we need things to actually start off that domino effect. Doubling +1/+1 counters every combat doesn't do us any good unless we already initially have +1/+1 counters in play. And it might not always be in our best interest or what we want to play creatures that enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on them. But a card like Scale the Heights can get a +1/+1 counter into play while ramping us, which we already are looking forward to doing, and it checks both boxes. It's not as mana value efficient, but it is more synergistic with our deck and helps our deck be one constructive unit. Going back to one of our life gain examples, everyone knows that in those life decks you play cards like a Johnny's Pragmates, and if you're playing the Abzan commander, you might consider playing Bilbo that lets you gain additional life when you gain life, and it triggers cards like Karlov of the Ghost Council. You might want to play effects that double the amount of life you gain, or you might want to put into play effects that whenever you gain life, opponents lose life. But you can play all of those cards, but you have to have ways to gain the triggers of life. And Scale the Heights can replace a card like Farseek or Nature's Lore and let us gain life and play additional lands and draw cards. In those same Abzan-based life gain decks, we are used to playing budget cards like Putrefy and Assassin's Trophy to destroy non-land permanents. But if you look at cards with higher mana value, like Mortality Spear, which are less efficient on the upfront cost, but because of the synergy with our deck, actually cost less mana than Putrefy and give our opponent less back, like Assassin's Trophy. Your deck has to already be doing what it's supposed to be doing in order for this card to be as efficient as you want it to be, but we all plan on having our decks do what the thing is supposed to be doing. And speaking of decks needing to do what they're supposed to be doing, if you have an Azorius life gain deck, or a deck that has the Azorius colors as part of that commander, you might be already playing a card like Counterspell to deal with the opponent's threat or destruction spell. You might want to sacrifice mana efficiency and put in a more synergistic card like Absorb. It does the exact same thing as Counterspell, but for 1 more white, you gain 3 life. It triggers all of those life gain effects, and your commander cares about gaining life, and your cards care about gaining life. You can gain double the life and deal your opponent damage equal to the amount of life. But there has to be cards in your deck that care about improving your strategy, and there has to be cards in the deck that make your strategy run. You can put fantastic rims on your tire, but unless you put gasoline in the engine, or you charged your car last night, it does not matter. Your car's not going to move. You can't show off your nice car unless you're making consistent efforts to charge and maintain your vehicle. Just like you have to have things in the commander gameplay that maintain your one coherent strategy moving. And optimizing for mana value or optimizing for cheaper cards or cards we're used to playing does not always make the commander deck run. Going back to my Animar example, the commander format is very familiar with cards like Cyclonic Rift. They're very efficient at dealing with one thing, or they can really set your opponent back. But if your deck is a +1/+1 counter-based deck that cares about having giant alpha strikes because, man, you doubled and doubled and doubled your counters, you might just want to play a card like Wave Goodbye. It's less efficient because it doesn't deal with everything, but your deck doesn't actually care about dealing with everything. It cares about having giant creatures and alpha striking your opponents. This is actually more mana value efficient in that type of deck. It costs 4 mana instead of the 7 that Cyclonic Rift does. And there are cards like this being printed constantly in a ton of commander sets that care about a specific niche of commander and help that deck run. Now, this card does not help your deck run. It helps you finish the game for less mana. And everyone knows what happens when the game is board wiped over and over, and there's board stalls, and it slows down. And one type of board wipe that might not cause a board stall is if you're playing a white deck and you run Wrath of God, 4 mana destroy all creatures. If you have a +1/+1 counter deck, going back to our Karlov of the Ghost Council deck, you might want to play a card like Damning Verdict instead. For 5 mana, it's less mana value efficient by 1, but it only destroys creatures without +1/+1 counters on them, or counters of any kind. And you know that your Karlov of the Ghost Council deck is going to have plenty of +1/+1 counters, from your Johnny's Pride mates to everything in between. You don't want to be sacrificing the synergy of your deck on the altar of mana efficiency. Your curve does not matter if you are curving into losing. Your deck has to be coherent, the gears have to turn, you have to keep oiling the wheels. Oil the wheels with cards like Scale the Heights. Oil the wheels with cards like Absorb that gain you incidental life, that care about +1/+1 counters if your deck does that. Your deck has to be moving